Welcome to the US Daily Brief channel. In the war between Ukraine and Russia, September and October are a nightmare for the Russian, and Putin lost almost all of what he earned in just 40 days and 7 months. In fact, if we take into account the psychological state of the Russian army, the anger of the Russian people and the pressure of the West on the Russian Federation, Russian President Vladimir Putin lost 10 times more than he had. After the explosion and destruction of the Crimean Bridge, Putin fired hundreds of missiles at Ukraine in the last 24 hours in an inhumane retaliation. But this heavy missile attack did not deter the Ukrainian fighters, and Ukraine continues its offensive against the Russian army, intercepting the Russian missiles and retaliating the Russian army. We continue to witness the legendary struggles of the Ukrainian warriors in the war. After the attack on the Kerch Bridge over Crimea, an important logistics network of the Russian army was damaged. Russia blames the Ukrainian army for the attack. Putin rolled up his sleeves to avenge the attack in Crimea. Having prepared a bloody plan, Putin, together with Sergei Surovikin, known as General Armageddon, whom he appointed as the head of the army, started to rain missiles on the Ukrainian capital Kiev in the morning. The attacks of the Ukrainian army were aimed at the city centers and the civilian population. This attack to intimidate the Ukrainian people did not achieve the desired success. Because the people of Ukraine did not fall into Putin's trap, and they stood together and sang their national anthem in the streets, keeping their cool. The Ukrainians, walking around with Ukrainian flags in their hands, gave the message that they continued their struggle from where they left off. The Ukrainian army has deployed missile defense systems against Putin's army shower of missiles, and many missiles of the Russian army were destroyed before reaching their target. Thanks to the successful defensive interventions of the Ukrainian army, thousands of civilian lives in Ukraine were saved. The Ukrainian army was accepted to retreat into its shell and paused for a while after Putin's incredible attack. However, Ukrainian President Zelensky said that, contrary to popular belief, the Ukrainian army will continue its attacks by adding new ones. Immediately after Zelensky announced that the Ukrainian army would continue their struggle without interruption, the warehouse of the Ministry of Defense exploded in Russia. Pavel Kulakov, head of the Nekrasovsky district of the region, said that a fire broke out in a warehouse belonging to the Ministry of Defense in the village of Burmakino in the Yaroslav region. The fire occurred in the 6th Armory belonging to the Navy enterprise of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. The flames that broke out in the warehouse of the Russian Ministry of Defense engulfed the entire building. All the weapons and military equipment of the Russian army in the arsenal are unusable. Extinguishing work continues in the Russian arsenal. In the Yaroslav region, a kindergarten and a school were evacuated in the village of Burmakino. Recently, news of multiple fires and explosions came from Russian warehouses. There was a fire in the ammunition depot in the Belgorod region recently. Local residents had reported an explosion in the area, which lasted several hours. Explosions were also reported at a military airport near Simferopol. Earlier, the occupation administration of Crimea announced that ammunition exploded in a warehouse in the village of Maiskoye. About 2,000 people reported that they had been evacuated from the village. Russia's defense ministry said the blasts were a sabotage that damaged a military warehouse and civilian facilities, including power lines, railways, a power station, and a number of residential buildings. It seems that the Ukrainian intelligence service is at work again. He's trying to prevent the Russian army from entering the battle arena by destroying their arsenals. Fires and explosions in the Russian army's arsenals make the already scarce supply of weapons and ammunition even more difficult. The Russian army took the biggest blow in the war by losing its weapons to the Ukrainian army. The Russian army is paying a heavy price for this mistake they made while withdrawing from the regions they lost. In addition to the Ukrainian army's seizure of weapons, the Russian army also got into trouble with sanctions. Ukrainian allies are uniting against Russia and blocking all aid to the Russian army. In the near future, the Russian army will face the Ukrainian army and will not even be able to find a weapon to fight. Russia's war policies also became the target of criticism. The problem of weapons and ammunition experienced by the Russian army attracts everyone's attention. Ben Hodges, former commander of the US Army Europe, said in a statement that he acknowledged that Russia is facing problems with its ammunition supply. We know that because of the sanctions, the Russians were unable to supply their sensitive munitions, he said. Speaking on Monday about the Russian military's missile strikes against the urban centers in Ukraine, Hoyts said Russia launched the largest airstrikes on Ukrainian cities since the beginning of the war, and emergency services said at least 19 people were killed and 105 injured. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, General Valery Zaluzny, said that Ukraine intercepted 41 of the 75 missiles launched. It's interesting that the Ukrainians were able to shoot down so many Russian missiles, said Hoyts. On Monday, just after the start of Russia's missile strikes, President Joe Biden, in a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, pledged to continue U.S. Secretary assistance, including advanced air defense systems. The United States once again showed that it stands behind Ukraine. As the Russian military continues its attacks on Ukrainian urban centers, Putin is busy tackling yet another scourge. After the declaration of mobilization, Putin is trying to stop the escape from the country. Less than 3 weeks ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered that 300,000 soldiers be called in to support the broken army lines on the battlefields in Ukraine. Immediately after the declaration of mobilization, a great wave of immigration started to the borders of Russia. There were roughly as many escapes in Russia as the number of soldiers targeted for inclusion in the army. To avoid being sent to the front, the Russian people embark on a journey of hope to the Russian border by plane, by car, by bicycle and on foot. They are looking for a shelter that will accept them in countries neighboring and close to Russia. Fearing Putin's imposition of mobilization, the Russian people crossed their land borders to Finland or Mongolia, bought expensive plane tickets to Turkey or Serbia, fled to the former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Georgia and Armenia. There are even rumors that 2 Russian refugees are on their way by boat to a remote Alaskan island in the Bering Sea. The Ministry of Internal Affairs of Kazakhstan, which shares a border with Russia, reported that 200,000 Russians arrived this week from the mobilization announcement. In Turkey, where unlike in the EU, direct flights from Russia are allowed to land, officials did not disclose arrival figures, but dozens of daily flights land in many Turkish cities, mostly filled with war-age men. Some of the Russian men trying to avoid conscription said they initially believed in official assurances that only men with military experience would be called in. However, rumors of a sprawling network were circulating that incinerated men who were clearly unfit for the service or lacked the relevant training or skills. The Kremlin blamed over-enthusiastic local officials. Russia has 1 million active duty military personnel, of whom about 200,000 took part in the first attack on Ukraine. Is the reason why Ukraine, with a population of 44 million, still has not been captured and completely occupied in 8 months of the war? Is it simply a poorly managed war policy? Or is it the legendary struggles of the Ukrainian people and army as an example to the whole world? We look forward to your comments. Thanks for watching us.